In the old, creaky house on the outskirts of town, there lived a young couple. They had heard the rumors of the house being haunted, but they didn't believe in such things. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, they heard a strange noise coming from the attic. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate. As they climbed the stairs, the noise grew louder and more sinister. Finally, they reached the top, and the door to the attic creaked open. To their horror, they found themselves face to face with a ghostly figure. They screamed and tried to run, but the ghost blocked their way. Just as they thought it was all over, the ghost spoke. "I'm not here to harm you," it said. "I'm here to warn you. Get out of this house now, or you'll suffer the same fate as me." With that, the ghost disappeared, and the couple realized that they were standing on a trapdoor. They opened it, and to their shock, they found a shallow grave with the remains of the previous owners. They immediately fled the house, never to return again. Emily had always been afraid of elevators, but she had to take one every day to get to her office on the 15th floor. One day, as she stepped into the elevator, she noticed that the button for the 13th floor was missing. Emily didn't think too much of it and pressed the button for the 15th floor. But as the elevator began to ascend, it suddenly jolted to a stop. Emily felt her heart race as the lights flickered and the elevator car shuddered. She pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. She tried her phone, but there was no signal. Emily was trapped in the elevator with no way out. As the minutes turned into hours, Emily began to hear strange noises coming from outside the elevator car. She could hear what sounded like footsteps, but there was no one there when she peeked through the crack in the doors. As the hours turned into days, Emily began to lose all hope of being rescued. She started to feel like she was going insane, trapped in the tiny elevator car with no food or water. But then, on the 4th day, the door suddenly opened. Emily stepped out, weak and disoriented, and looked around. She was on the 13th floor, the floor that had been missing from the elevator buttons. As she stumbled down the hallway, Emily realized that something was terribly wrong. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with an otherworldly energy. And that's when Emily saw them. They were shadowy figures, lurking in the corners and watching her with cold, dead eyes. They had been waiting for her, and now they had her. Emily screamed, but it was too late. She had been lured into a trap, and now she was theirs to keep forever. Jacob had always been fascinated by the abandoned house at the end of his street. It was a large, old mansion that had been empty for as long as he could remember. One day, he decided to explore it. As he stepped inside, Jacob was struck by the eerie silence that permeated the house. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floors creaked beneath his feet. But despite its dilapidated state, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that someone had recently been there. He continued exploring the house, room by room, until he came to a locked door. Jacob tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he decided to leave and come back with a key. The next day, Jacob returned with a set of lockpicks. He successfully unlocked the door and stepped inside, but what he found made him wish he had never entered the house. The room was filled with dark magic, and at the center of it all was a book. The pages of the book were made of human skin, and the ink was written in blood. Jacob couldn't believe what he was seeing. As he tried to leave the room, he heard a voice behind him. "You should never have come here, Jacob." Jacob turned around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the doors to the room slammed shut, and Jacob was trapped inside. He could hear the sound of chanting coming from outside the room, and he knew that whoever had trapped him there was performing some sort of dark ritual. Just when he thought it was all over, Jacob saw a figure appear in front of him. It was his own reflection, but it was twisted and evil-looking. The reflection smiled and said, "Welcome to your new home, Jacob. You will be staying here for a very long time." And that's when Jacob realized that he had been lured into the house as part of a dark magic's plan to trap him there forever. Olivia had always been fascinated with the antique mirror in her bedroom. It was a beautiful ornate mirror, with a golden frame and intricate carvings. But there was something about it that always made her feel uneasy. One night, as Olivia was getting ready for bed, she caught a glimpse of a reflection in the mirror. But it wasn't her own face she saw staring back at her. It was the face of a young girl with long black hair and piercing green eyes. Olivia turned around, but no one was there. She tried to shake it off and went to bed, but she couldn't help feeling like she was being watched. The next morning, Olivia woke up to find that her reflection in the mirror was still that of the young girl. She tried to wipe it off, but it wouldn't budge. As the days went on, the reflection seemed to become more and more lifelike. One night, Olivia decided to take a closer look at the mirror. As she leaned in, she saw the reflection of the young girl reach out and grab her by the wrist. Olivia tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. Just when she thought it was all over, the reflection of the young girl spoke. "Olivia, it's me, your sister. I've been trapped in this mirror for years. You're the only one who can help me." Olivia was shocked. She had never known she had a sister. But as she looked closer, she realized that the reflection did bear a striking resemblance to her. She decided to help her sister, and the two of them worked together to find a way to break the curse that had trapped her in the mirror. They finally succeeded, and Olivia's sister was free at last. But as Olivia looked into the mirror one last time, she saw that her own reflection had been replaced by that of her sister. And that's when she realized that the curse had been passed on to her, and she was now trapped in the mirror for all eternity. Samantha had always been afraid of her grandmother's old doll. It was a porcelain doll with a cracked face and an eerie smile. But when her grandmother passed away, Samantha found herself inheriting the doll. She tried to throw it away, but something made her hesitate. One night, Samantha heard a strange noise coming from her closet. When she opened it, the doll was sitting on her bed, its eyes fixed on her. Samantha tried to ignore it and went back to sleep, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in her room. The next morning, Samantha woke up to find the doll sitting at the foot of her bed, its head turned towards her. She tried to ignore it again, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. That night, Samantha had a dream that she was playing with the doll. But as the dream went on, the doll's smile became more and more twisted. Samantha woke up, heart racing, to find the doll standing at the edge of her bed. She tried to get up, but found that she couldn't move. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her every move, and its smile became wider and more sinister. Suddenly, the doll started to move towards her, its arms outstretched. Just when she thought it was all over, Samantha heard a knock on her door. It was her brother, who had come to check on her. The moment he stepped into the room, the doll stopped moving and went back to its original position. Samantha was relieved and thought it was just her imagination. But when she turned to look at the doll one last time before going back to sleep, she saw that its smile had become even more twisted than before. And that's when she realized that the doll was still alive, and it was only biding its time before it could take control. Emily had always loved going on hikes in the woods near her cabin. But on this particular day, something felt off. As she walked deeper into the woods, she had a distinct feeling that she was being watched. She tried to shake off the feeling and continue on her hike, but then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but no one was there. Emily started to pick up the pace, trying to get back to her cabin as quickly as possible. As she made her way through the dense forest, she realized that she was lost. The trees all looked the same and the winding paths seemed to go in circles. Panic set in as she realized she might not make it out of the woods alive. Just then, she heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Emily froze, heart racing as she tried to make out the source of the noise. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the bushes, slowly making its way towards her. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes and a twisted smile. Emily tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped, face to face with the terrifying creature. Just when she thought it was all over, the creature spoke in a deep, raspy voice. "Emily, it's me, your neighbor. You must have taken a wrong turn, and ended up in my yard. You're safe now." Relieved and embarrassed, Emily thanked her neighbor and made her way back to her cabin, still shaking from the experience. But as she lay in bed at night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She looked out the window and saw her neighbor's house in the distance. It was then that she realized that the voice of the creature in the woods didn't sound anything like her neighbor's voice. She sat up in bed, realizing with a sinking feeling that she had just encountered something truly terrifying in the woods. And she had no idea what it really was. Jacob was an experienced hiker, but he had never ventured into the deep woods before. He had heard stories of hikers getting lost in the vast forests, never to be seen again, but he didn't believe in the legends. As he set out on his hike, he marveled at the beauty of the forest. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a golden glow over everything. The birds sung sweetly, and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze was like a symphony. But as night fell, the woods became a sinister place. The once peaceful forest turned into a maze of twisted branches and gnarled roots. Jacob stumbled and tripped over the rough terrain, his nerves frayed. Just as he was about to give up hope, he saw a small light in the distance. He ran towards it, hoping it was a sign of civilization. As he drew closer, he saw a figure holding the light. It was an old woman, with long, gray hair and a face twisted with age. She beckoned him closer, and he followed. But as he drew closer, he realized that the woman was not what she seemed. Her face was contorted with malice, and her eyes were filled with an otherworldly glow. She led him deeper into the woods, her grip on his arm tightening with every step. He tried to resist, but he was too weak and disoriented to break free. Hours passed as they walked, with no end in sight. Jacob knew he was in grave danger, but he couldn't escape. He was at the mercy of the old woman and the dark forces that controlled her. As dawn approached, the woman stopped and turned to face Jacob. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever before, and she whispered in a voice that chilled him to the bone. "You mine now," she said. "You'll never leave this forest alive." And with those words, Jacob felt a cold hand grab his heart. He fell to the ground, his lifeless body consumed by the darkness of the forest. Jane had always been afraid of mirrors. She couldn't explain why, but she always felt like there was something sinister lurking behind the glass. One day, she moved into a new apartment and noticed a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. She tried to ignore it, but every time she passed by, she couldn't help but feel like it was watching her. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. Jane would see movement in the reflection, even when no one was in the room with her. She would hear whispers coming from the mirror, as if someone was trying to communicate with her. But the most terrifying thing of all was what happened when she looked directly into the mirror. Instead of seeing her own reflection, she would see a twisted, demonic version of herself, with horns and glowing red eyes. Jane tried to ignore it, but the more she tried to avoid the mirror, the stronger its pull became. She felt like she was being drawn towards it, as if it was calling out to her. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She stood in front of the mirror, staring directly into its depths, and demanded to know what it wanted from her. And that's when she saw it, the figure standing behind her in the reflection. It was a creature with razor-sharp teeth and glowing eyes, ready to pounce. Jane turned around just in time to see the creature lunge at her, but it was too late. The mirror had already claimed her soul, trapping her in a world of eternal darkness and terror. Jenna and her friends decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the woods. They had heard stories about strange occurrences in the area, but they didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural beings. They were just looking for a peaceful weekend away from the city. But as soon as they arrived, things started to feel off. The cabin was old and musty, with strange markings etched into the walls. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of leaves rustling outside. As night fell, the group decided to make dinner and settle in for the night. But as they sat around the table, they heard a loud banging on the door. Jenna cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole, but she saw nothing. She opened the door, and once again, there was nothing there. Suddenly, they heard footsteps upstairs, as if someone was walking around. They slowly made their way up the stairs, only to find the bedroom empty. But as they turned to leave, they saw a shadowy figure out of the corner of their eye. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone in the cabin. They frantically searched for a way out, but the windows were boarded up and the door was stuck. As they huddled together in fear, they heard a voice whispering in their ears, telling them that they would never leave the cabin alive. The voice promised to torture them until they begged for death. One by one, the group succumbed to the voice's demands, breaking down in terror and agony. And as the sun rose the next morning, the cabin stood empty, a silent reminder of the horrors that had occurred within its walls. Mark and his friends were going on a road trip, driving across the country to visit all the famous landmarks they had always dreamed of seeing. They had been on the road for days, and were now in the middle of the desert, miles away from civilization. As they drove down a long, winding road, they suddenly saw a figure in the distance. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes and waving frantically at them. Mark slowed down the car and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he asked. The woman looked up at him with eyes that were dark and empty. "Please, help me," she said. "My car broke down and I've been stranded out here for hours." Mark and his friends were hesitant at first, but they eventually decided to help the woman. They offered to give her a ride to the nearest town, and she gratefully accepted. As they drove, the woman told them her story. She had been driving to a job interview when her car broke down, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She had no food or water, and was desperate for help. After what seemed like hours, they finally arrived at a small town. Mark and his friends dropped the woman off at a gas station and watched as she walked away, feeling proud of themselves for doing a good deed. But as they continued on their road trip, strange things began to happen. They started to see the woman everywhere they went, sometimes standing by the side of the road or watching them from a distance. And then, one night, they saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road, blocking their way. Mark slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. They hit the woman with a sickening thud. They got out of the car and looked at the woman's lifeless body lying on the road. And that's when they noticed something strange. The woman's eyes were glowing in the darkness, and her skin was pale and cold. It was then that Mark and his friends realized that they had picked up something far more sinister than just a stranded traveler. They had unwittingly picked up a ghost, and now they were cursed to live with the consequences of their mistake. John had always been fascinated by abandoned buildings. He loved exploring them, trying to imagine what they might have looked like in their prime. One day, John received a tip about an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, and no one knew what had happened to the family that had once lived there. John couldn't resist the opportunity to explore the mansion, and he gathered his friends and headed to the mansion. As they explored the mansion, John couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was something strange about the mansion, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. But as they continued to explore, they found something that shocked them to the core. In one of the bedrooms, they found a diary belonging to the daughter of the family that had lived in the mansion. As they read through the diary, John and his friends learned the horrifying truth about what had happened to the family. The daughter had been suffering from a mysterious illness, one that had driven her to madness. In her madness, she had killed her entire family, one by one, before finally taking her own life. As John and his friends tried to leave the mansion, they found that the doors and windows had been locked from the outside, trapping them inside. They were forced to spend the night in the mansion, surrounded by the ghosts of the family that had once lived there. But just when they had lost all hope, they heard a voice calling out to them. It was the voice of the daughter, begging for forgiveness and asking for their help in breaking the curse that had trapped her in the mansion. John and his friends were terrified, but they knew that they had to help their daughter find peace. They worked together to solve the mystery of the mansion and the curse that had trapped the daughter's spirit inside. In the end, they were able to break the curse and free the daughter's spirit from the mansion. John and his friends left the mansion, grateful to be alive but forever haunted by the horrors that they had experienced inside. Anna was a successful businesswoman who had worked hard to achieve her success. She was proud of her accomplishments, but she knew that it had come at a cost. She had sacrificed her personal life for her career, and she was lonely and unfulfilled. One day, Anna received an invitation to attend a business conference in a remote mountain town. The conference promised to be a great opportunity to network and make new connections, and Anna eagerly accepted the invitation. As she made her way to the mountain town, Anna couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. She had always loved the outdoors, and the thought of spending time in the mountains filled her with a sense of joy and wonder. But when she arrived at the town, she quickly realized that something was wrong. The town was eerily quiet, with no signs of life or activity. Anna brushed it off as a strange quirk of the town and continued to the conference center. But as the day progressed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The other conference attendees were all strangely quiet and reserved, avoiding Anna's attempts to strike up a conversation. And when she tried to leave the conference center to explore the town, she found that all the doors were locked and she was trapped inside. As the night wore on, Anna began to feel a growing sense of unease. She tried to call for help, but there was no signal on her phone. And when she tried to break out of the conference center, she found that the windows had been boarded up from the outside. It was then that Anna realized the truth. The conference was a trap, a ploy to lure successful business people to the town and trap them there forever. Anna was terrified, realizing that she would be trapped in the town forever, forced to live out the rest of her life in the prison of her own success. But just when she had lost all hope, she heard a strange noise coming from outside. It was the sound of helicopters. coming to rescue her and the other trapped Business people. Anna was shocked and overjoyed as she was rescued from the town. But as she looked back on the experience, she realized the true horror of what she had experienced. She had come to the conference looking for professional success, but she had almost lost everything in the process. Carla had always been fascinated by the supernatural. She loved to read horror stories and watch scary movies, and she had always dreamed of encountering a ghost or a demon. One day, she heard about an abandoned house on the edge of town that was rumored to be haunted. Carla was thrilled at the prospect of exploring the creepy old mansion, and she quickly gathered a group of friends to join her. As they made their way to the house, Carla couldn't contain her excitement. She was sure that they would find something terrifying inside, and she couldn't wait to experience the thrill of being scared. But as they entered the house, Carla quickly realized that something was wrong. The air was thick with a heavy, oppressive energy, and she felt a sense of dread creeping over her. Her friends were oblivious to the danger, laughing and joking as they explored the rooms. But Carla couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in the house. As they made their way to the second floor, they heard a strange noise coming from one of the rooms. It was a low, guttural moan, like the sound of someone in pain. Carla's friends wanted to investigate, but she knew that it was a bad idea. She begged them to leave the house, but they ignored her, determined to find the source of the noise. As they entered the room, Carla's worst fears were realized. There was a dark, shadowy figure in the corner, writhing in agony. Carla's friends were terrified, and they started to run out of the room. But Carla stayed behind, drawn to the figure in the corner. As she approached the figure, she realized with horror that it was not a ghost or a demon. It was a human being, twisted and contorted in pain. Carla was horrified. She had come to the house looking for a supernatural thrill, but instead, she had stumbled upon a human tragedy. The figure in the corner was a victim of a terrible crime, left to die alone in the abandoned house. Carla's friends were shocked and horrified when she told them what she had discovered. They quickly called the police, who arrived to investigate the scene. Carla couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and shame. She had come to the house looking for a cheap thrill, but instead, she had stumbled upon a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sarah was a young girl who loved exploring the forest behind her house. She spent hours wandering through the trees, admiring the wildlife and picking flowers. But one day, as she was walking deeper into the forest, she heard a strange noise. It was a low growl, coming from somewhere in the bushes. Sarah froze in terror. She knew that growl could only belong to one thing, a bear. She had heard stories of bears attacking hikers in the forest, and she knew that she had to get away quickly. She turned to run back the way she had come, but to her horror, she saw that the path was blocked by a large, muscular bear. She was trapped, with no way to escape. The bear started to approach her slowly, its eyes fixed on her. Sarah closed her eyes and waited for the worst to happen. But then, to her surprise, the bear spoke to her in a human voice. "Don't be afraid," it said. "I won't hurt you." Sarah was shocked. She had never heard of a talking bear before. But as she looked closer, she saw that the bear wasn't a real bear at all. It was a man, dressed in a bear costume. The man explained that he was a hermit who lived in the forest, and that he had been watching Sarah for some time. He had seen how happy she was exploring the woods, and he wanted to join her. At first, Sarah was hesitant. She had been scared out of her wits, and the thought of spending time with a strange man in a bear suit didn't appeal to her. But the man seemed friendly and harmless, so she decided to give him a chance. They spent the next few weeks exploring the forest together. Sarah showed the man all of her favorite spots, and they had picnics and played games. Sarah had never felt so happy and carefree. But one day, as they were wandering through the woods, Sarah noticed something strange. The man had a strange glint in his eye, and he was looking at her in a way that made her feel uneasy. Suddenly, the man lunged at her, and Sarah realized too late that she had made a terrible mistake. The man wasn't harmless at all. He was a dangerous predator, and she was his prey. Sarah fought back as best she could, but the man was too strong. He overpowered her and took her back to his cabin deep in the woods. Sarah was never seen again. The man continued to live in the forest, dressed in his bear suit, waiting for his next victim to come wandering by. Laura was excited to move into her new apartment in the city. It was small, but cozy, and the location was perfect for her job and social life. She had heard stories about strange things happening in the building, but she dismissed them as rumors. But as Laura settled into her new home, she began to experience strange occurrences. Objects would move by themselves, and she could hear footsteps and whispers coming from the walls at night. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a knock on the door. When she opened it, there was no one there. She was confused, but she shrugged it off and went to sleep. The next day, as she was leaving for work, she saw a note taped to her door. It read, "I'm watching you." Laura was scared, but she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a prank, or a message left by a previous tenant. But the strange occurrences continued. Laura would wake up to find her furniture rearranged, or her clothes scattered around the room. She started to feel like she was losing her mind. One night, as she was lying in bed, she heard a voice whispering her name. She sat up in bed, heart racing, and saw a figure materialize before her. It was a woman with a pale face and dark hair, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The woman explained that she was a former resident of the building, and that she had been murdered in Laura's apartment years ago. She begged Laura to help her find her killer, so that her spirit could finally rest in peace. Laura was hesitant at first, but she agreed to help the ghostly woman. She researched the history of the building, and eventually found evidence that led her to the killer's identity. As she confronted the killer, she felt a sense of satisfaction. The woman's spirit disappeared in a flash of light, and Laura was left standing alone in her apartment. But then, to her shock, she realized a twist in the story. The woman who had appeared to her wasn't a ghost at all. She was a psychic medium, who had been hired by the building's owner to scare Laura away. The owner had a vendetta against Laura, and had hired the medium to drive her out of the building. Laura was both relieved and angry. Relieved that the strange occurrences were finally explained, but angry at the lengths the building's owner had gone on to make her leave. She decided to stay in her apartment, determined not to let the owner's schemes succeed. And as she settled into her new resolve, she felt a sense of strength and determination that she had never felt before. Jenny was excited to start her new job at the old bookstore in town. She had always loved books, and the thought of spending her days surrounded by them was a dream come true. But as Jenny settled into her new role, she began to notice strange things happening in the store. Books would move from one shelf to another overnight, and sometimes she could hear faint whispers coming from the stacks. At first, she tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the strange occurrences became more frequent and intense. One night, Jenny stayed late to organize the shelves. As she reached for a book on the top shelf, she felt a cold hand grab her wrist. She turned around, but no one was there. Jenny was terrified. Was the store haunted? She had heard rumors that the building had been used as a hospital during the war, and that many patients had died there. As she tried to leave the store, she heard a voice calling out to her. "Jenny, don't leave," the voice whispered. "I need your help." Jenny froze in terror. Who was speaking to her? Was it a ghost? But then, to her surprise, she saw a figure materialize before her. It was a woman dressed in a nurse's uniform, with a pleading expression on her face. The woman explained that she had died in the hospital wing of the building during the war, and that her spirit had been trapped in the store ever since. She begged Jenny to help her find peace by finding her old diary, which contained the details of a secret love affair that had led to her tragic demise. Jenny was hesitant at first, but she agreed to help the ghostly nurse. She searched the shelves for the diary, and eventually found it tucked away in a corner of the store. As she handed a diary to the ghostly nurse, she felt a sense of relief. The woman's spirit disappeared in a flash of light, and Jenny was left standing alone in the empty store. But then, to her shock, she realized the twist in the story. The bookstore wasn't haunted by ghosts at all. It was a place where the spirits of forgotten stories and characters were trapped, and the ghostly nurse was just one of many literary characters seeking release from their pages. Jenny had stumbled onto a world of magic and mystery that existed within the pages of the books, and she knew that she would never look at the store, or the books, in the same way again. Samantha and her friends had always been fascinated by the old abandoned mansion on the edge of town. They had heard all the stories about the ghosts that supposedly haunted the place, but they had never seen any evidence of the paranormal during their previous visits. One night, Samantha and her friends decided to spend the night in the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghostly apparitions that were set to roam the halls. As they settled in for the night, they heard strange noises coming from the other side of the house. Footsteps, whispers, and other unexplained sounds filled the air, making their skin crawl with fear. Suddenly, they heard a loud banging noise coming from the basement. Samantha and her friends crept down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, they saw a group of people huddled around a strange machine. The people were dressed in lab coats, and their faces were lit by the glow of the machine's pulsating lights. Samantha and her friends were terrified. What were these people doing in the basement of the abandoned mansion? Were they ghost hunters, like them, or something else entirely? Just then, one of the lab-coated figures turned to them and spoke. "Welcome, Samantha. We've been expecting you." Samantha froze in terror. How did they know her name? Had they been watching her? The figure continued, "You and your friends stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to see. But don't worry, we can make it all go away." Suddenly, Samantha and her friends felt a wave of dizziness wash over them. The world around them began to spin, and they felt themselves being lifted up and pulled away from the mansion. When they opened their eyes, they were standing outside the mansion, surrounded by darkness. It was as if the mansion and the lab-coated figures had never existed. Samantha and her friends were confused and scared. Had it all been a hallucination? A dream? As they walked away from the mansion, Samantha saw something that made her blood run cold. There, on the ground, was a small device that looked just like the one the lab-coated figures had been working on. It was then that Samantha realized the shocking truth. The mansion wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by a group of scientists conducting secret experiments. And Samantha and her friends had stumbled onto something that they were never meant to see. Ella had always been fascinated by the abandoned theme park on the outskirts of town. It had been closed for years, and the faded ride and crumbling buildings were a haunting reminder of the park's former glory. One day, Ella decided to sneak into the park and explore. She climbed over the fence and made her way towards the Ferris wheel, her heart beating fast with excitement. As she climbed onto the Ferris wheel car, she heard a strange creaking noise. Suddenly, the car jolted to life, and Ella was lifted high into the air. She tried to scream, but the wind was knocked out of her lungs as the car spun around and around. Ella closed her eyes, praying that the ride would come to a stop. When the ride finally slowed down, Ella opened her eyes and looked around. To her horror, she realized that she was no longer in the abandoned theme park. Instead, she was in a strange and unfamiliar world, with towering buildings and flashing lights. Ella stumbled out of the Ferris wheel car and onto the street. As she walked around, she realized that the people she passed were all staring at her in disbelief. She must have looked like an alien from another planet. Suddenly, Ella heard a loudspeaker announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the technical difficulties on the ride. We have accidentally transported a park guest to an alternate dimension. We are working to rectify the situation and return her to her own world." Ella realized in horror that she was trapped in this strange world, with no way of getting home. As she walked through the unfamiliar streets, she knew that she would never be the same again. But then, just as she had given up all hope, something miraculous happened. Ella heard a familiar creaking noise, and she looked up to see the Ferris wheel slowly turning in the distance. With a surge of hope, Ella began to run towards the ride. As she climbed back onto the Ferris wheel car, she heard a voice in her ear, "You were lucky this time, but remember, not all rides are meant to be taken." With a jolt, Ella was back in the abandoned theme park, surrounded by the broken-down ride and empty buildings. She stumbled out of the Ferris wheel car and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. As she lay there, she realized the shocking truth: the abandoned theme park wasn't just a place where old rides went to die. It was a portal to another dimension, a dangerous and unpredictable place where one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. Rachel and her friends had always loved exploring the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. It was rumored to be haunted, but they had never seen anything strange during their previous visits. One night, they decided to go back to the mansion and try to make contact with any spirits that might be lingering there. They brought along a Ouija board and candles, ready to conduct a séance. As they sat in the darkened room, the only sound was the soft rustle of the candles flickering in the wind. Rachel placed her hands on the Ouija board and asked, "Is anyone here with us?" At first, there was no response. Then, slowly but surely, the planchette began to move. Rachel and her friends watched in amazement as the board spelled out answers to their questions. But as the séance went on, the atmosphere in the room grew more and more tense. The answers became more cryptic and sinister. Rachel could feel an overwhelming sense of fear and dread creeping over her. Finally, they asked the spirit its name. The planchette spelled out, "I am the one who died here." Rachel and her friends froze in terror. Had they been communicating with the ghost all along? Suddenly, they heard a loud noise coming from the other side of the mansion. It sounded like someone was walking around, knocking over furniture and smashing things. Terrified, they grabbed their candles and began to run towards the exit. But as they neared the front door, they saw something that made their blood run cold. There, standing in front of them, was the figure of a woman. Her face was twisted in a grotesque expression of rage, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Rachel and her friends tried to run, but the woman was too fast. She chased them through the mansion, screaming and cursing. Finally, they burst through the front door and ran out into the night. As they looked back at the mansion, they saw the woman standing in the doorway, watching them. It wasn't until they got home that they realized the shocking truth. The woman they had seen was one of their own friends, dressed up in a ghostly costume to scare them. But as they laughed and joked about it, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something else in that mansion with them, something that wasn't human at all. It was a dark and stormy night, and Sarah was driving home from her late shift at work. She had just moved to the countryside and was still getting used to the winding roads and creepy surroundings. As she drove down a particularly isolated stretch of road, she saw something moving in the distance. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as she got closer, she realized it was a woman standing in the middle of the road. Sarah slammed on her brakes, narrowly avoiding hitting the woman. She got out of the car and approached the woman, who was drenched and shivering. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked. The woman looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Help me," she whispered. Sarah was hesitant to let a stranger into her car, but she couldn't leave the woman there in the pouring rain. She unlocked the door and the woman got in, gratefully. As they drove towards town, Sarah tried to make conversation with the woman, but she didn't say much. Sarah noticed that the woman's clothes were old-fashioned and torn, and she seemed out of place in the modern world. When they reached the town, Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a motel. "I can't take you all the way to my house, but you can stay here for the night," she said. The woman nodded and got out of the car. As Sarah drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. The next day, Sarah went to the motel to check on the woman, but the front desk clerk told her that no one had checked in under the woman's name. Sarah was confused and worried. Had she imagined the whole thing? That's when she saw a newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Local woman killed in car accident on isolated road." The photo accompanying the article was of the woman Sarah had picked up the night before. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the shocking truth. The woman she had picked up was a ghost, and she had been dead all along. Maggie loved to collect dolls. She had hundreds of them, all arranged neatly on shelves in her bedroom. But there was one doll that was her favorite, a beautiful antique dollhouse that had been passed down through her family for generations. The dollhouse was exquisite, with intricate details and tiny furniture that Maggie loved to arrange just so. But there was something eerie about it too, something that made Maggie feel uneasy. One night, Maggie woke up to a strange noise coming from her bedroom. She got out of bed and tiptoed over to the dollhouse. As she looked inside, she saw that the furniture had been moved around, as if someone had been playing with it. Maggie was scared, but she tried to brush it off as her imagination. But as the nights went on, she kept hearing strange noises and feeling like someone was watching her. Finally, Maggie decided to investigate. She set up a camera in her bedroom and pointed it at the dollhouse, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. The next morning, Maggie watched the footage in horror. The dollhouse was alive, with tiny figures moving around inside. And the figures looked just like her family members. Maggie was terrified, but she didn't know what to do. She tried to tell her family and friends, but no one believed her. One day, Maggie's mother went missing. Maggie was sure that the dollhouse was responsible. She went back to the footage and saw that her mother's figure had been taken out of the dollhouse and placed on the floor. Maggie decided that she had to destroy the dollhouse, no matter what the cost. She grabbed a hammer and smashed it to pieces. But as she did, she heard a voice whispering in her ear, "You never escape us." Maggie turned around and saw that the tiny figures from the dollhouse had come to life. They swarmed over her, pulling her down into the ruins of the dollhouse. Maggie screamed, but it was too late. She was trapped forever, a part of the haunted dollhouse that would terrorize generations to come. Jenny was a college student who needed some extra cash, so she decided to take on a babysitting job for a family in her neighborhood. The family had one child, a little girl named Emily. Jenny arrived at the house and was greeted by Emily's parents, who gave her a list of instructions and told her that they would be back in a few hours. Jenny spent the evening playing with Emily and putting her to bed. But as the night wore on, she began to hear strange noises coming from the basement. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around. Jenny tried to ignore it, thinking that it was just the house settling or maybe the family's cat. But the noise grew louder and more persistent. Finally, Jenny decided to investigate. She crept down the stairs to the basement and saw a figure hunched over a large trunk. The figure turned around and Jenny saw that it was a man with a scarred face and wild eyes. Jenny screamed and ran back up the stairs, but the man followed her. He chased her around the house, brandishing a large knife. Jenny was cornered in the living room, with the man looming over her. She was sure that she was going to die. But then, Emily appeared, holding a baseball bat. She swung it at the man and hit him square in the head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Jenny called the police and they arrived quickly. They arrested the man, who turned out to be a notorious serial killer that had been on the run for months. Jenny was hailed as a hero for saving Emily's life. But as she was leaving the house, she realized that something was off. The family's photos on the wall looked old and faded, and the furniture was outdated. Jenny asked the police about the family, but they didn't know anything. When they went to investigate, they found that the house had been abandoned for years. Jenny was shocked. She had been babysitting for a family that didn't even exist. The serial killer had lured her there with a fake job posting, hoping to kill her just like his other victims. Jenny was lucky to have escaped with her life. But she would never forget the terror of that night, and the realization that she had been so close to becoming another victim of the last babysitter's trap. Sarah was a college student who had just moved into a new apartment. She was excited to be living on her own for the first time, but there was something strange about the apartment that she couldn't quite put her finger on. One night, Sarah woke up to find her roommate, Lily, standing at the foot of her bed. But something was off about Lily. Her skin was ashen and her eyes were dark and empty. Sarah screamed and ran out of the room, but when she went back to investigate, Lily was gone. The next day, Sarah went to her landlord to ask about the previous tenants of the apartment. The landlord told her that there had been a young woman who had died in the apartment a year ago. Her name was Lily. Sarah was terrified, but she didn't want to leave the apartment. She tried to convince herself that she was just imagining things, that Lily was not really there. But every night, Lily would appear at the foot of Sarah's bed, her eyes staring into Sarah's soul. Sarah was unable to sleep, unable to function, as Lily haunted her every waking moment. One night, Sarah decided to confront Lily. She stood up to her and demanded that she leave her alone. Suddenly, Lily's eyes started to glow red, and she let out an ear-piercing scream. Sarah fell to the ground, writhing in pain, as she felt her body being torn apart. But then, everything went dark. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she found herself in a hospital room. Her parents were sitting by her bedside, tears streaming down their faces. "Sarah, you were in a terrible car accident," her mother said. "You've been in a coma for the past year. We're so glad you're finally awake." Sarah was confused, but then she remembered Lily. Lily was not a ghost haunting her, but a manifestation of her own guilt and trauma. She had been driving drunk when she crashed her car and killed her roommate, Lily. The dead roommate had never haunted her at all. It was all in Sarah's head. Samantha was an avid collector of antique dolls, and she had just acquired a beautiful dollhouse from a local estate sale. The dollhouse was intricately detailed, with miniature furniture and even tiny curtains on the windows. Samantha couldn't wait to display it in her home. But as soon as she brought the dollhouse home, strange things started to happen. The curtains would move on their own, and the miniature furniture would be rearranged once Samantha wasn't looking. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the strange occurrences became more and more frequent. One night, Samantha was awakened by a strange noise coming from the dollhouse. She got out of bed and approached the dollhouse, her heart pounding in her chest. As she looked through the tiny window, she saw a figure moving inside. It was a tiny porcelain doll, dressed in a Victorian-era gown. Samantha gasped in shock, as the doll turned to look at her with tiny, unblinking eyes. The next morning, Samantha decided to investigate the dollhouse further. As she opened a tiny front door, she felt a cold breeze wash over her. Inside, the furniture was arranged in a sinister pattern, as if someone had deliberately arranged it that way. But as she looked closer, she saw that the dolls were not dolls at all. They were tiny, lifelike replicas of people she knew. Her friends, her family, even her own miniature likeness was there. As she gasped in horror, she felt a tiny hand wrap around her ankle. She looked down and saw the Victorian doll looking up at her with a wicked grin. "You belong to me now," the doll whispered, as Samantha felt herself shrinking down to doll size. And with that, she was trapped in the dollhouse forever, a tiny plaything for the porcelain dolls to torment and torture. Sarah had always been curious about the attic in her family's old house. Her parents had told her that it was a storage space, filled with old clothes, books, and toys that they no longer used. But Sarah had a feeling that there was something more to the attic than just junk. One day, when her parents were out of the house, Sarah decided to investigate the attic. She climbed the creaky stairs, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. When she reached the top, she found herself in a dimly lit room, filled with cobwebs and dust. At first, Sarah didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There were boxes and bags stacked up hesitantly against the walls, and a few old pieces of furniture covered in sheets. But then, something caught her eye. It was a mirror. A large, ornate mirror that seemed out of place in the cluttered attic. Sarah walked over to it, studying her reflection in the dusty glass. But then, she saw something move behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, and saw that her reflection was no longer her own. It was someone else entirely. A girl with dark hair and a pale face, staring back at her with cold, dead eyes. Sarah tried to look away, but she couldn't. The girl in the mirror seemed to be drawing her in, tempting her with a strange and terrifying power. Sarah felt her mind slipping away, her body becoming numb and cold. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Sarah blinked, and her own reflection was staring back at her once more. She stumbled away from the mirror, her heart racing with fear and confusion. Sarah never went back to the attic again. She tried to forget about the mirror and the girl who had appeared in it, but she could never quite shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to look into the glass once more. Lena had always been fascinated by the woods near her house. She loved to explore the winding paths and discover hidden treasures. But one day, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a shadow. A shapeless, dark figure that seemed to move in the trees, always just out of sight. Lena tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As the days went on, the shadow appeared more frequently. Lena became obsessed with it, determined to discover what it was and where it came from. She spent every spare moment in the woods, following the shadow's movements and trying to catch a glimpse of its form. One night, Lena finally saw the shadow up close. It was standing in a clearing, just a few feet away from her. Lena froze, unsure of what to do. The shadow seemed to grow larger and more menacing, and Lena realized with horror that it was reaching out to her. But then, something unexpected happened. The shadow began to change shape, transforming into a beautiful, radiant light. Lena felt a sense of warmth and comfort wash over her, and she knew that she was safe. The light spoke to Lena, telling her that it had been watching over her all along, protecting her from harm. It was a guardian spirit, one that had been assigned to watch over Lena and keep her safe in the woods. From that day on, Lena no longer feared the shadow in the woods. She knew that it was there to protect her, and she felt grateful for its presence in her life. She continued to explore the woods, but now she did so with a newfound sense of wonder and appreciation for the mysteries of the natural world. It was just another ordinary day for the employees of the high-rise office building. They had all taken the elevator up to their respective floors and were busy at work when the elevator suddenly stopped moving. At first, they thought it was just a minor glitch, but then the lights flickered and strange noises could be heard coming from the elevator shaft. Panic set in as they realized that they were trapped inside the elevator, with no way out. As they frantically tried to call for help, the lights went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. That's when the real horror began. Whispers could be heard, as if someone was standing right next to them, breathing heavily in their ear. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the air became thick with a sense of foreboding. And then, they heard a voice that spoke in an ancient language, one that none of them could understand. The employees were petrified, huddled together in fear as the voice continued to speak. They could feel a cold presence in the elevator with them, one that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. Just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, the elevator suddenly jerked back to life and began to move again. It finally came to a stop on the next floor, and the door slowly opened. The employees stumbled out of the elevator, shaken to their core. They looked around, but there was no one there. No sign of the mysterious voice or the cold presence that had haunted them just moments before. To this day, no one knows what caused the elevator to malfunction and what kind of entity they had encountered inside. But one thing was certain, they would never look at elevators the same way again. The old farmhouse had been abandoned for years, but it had always been a source of fascination for the locals. Stories had circulated for decades about the strange things that had happened there, and the rumors only grew stronger as the years went on. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the farmhouse and see for themselves what all the fuss was about. They drove out to the property, parked their car, and walked up to the house. The place was in shambles, with broken windows and a roof that was caving in. But despite its obvious state of disrepair, the friends couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they approached the front door. Once inside, they realized that the rumors were true. Strange things were happening in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and they heard a sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As they explored the house, they found themselves drawn to a locked door at the end of a hallway. It was the only door in the entire house that seemed to be in good condition, with a shiny brass knob and fresh paint. Curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to break open the door. When they did, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. Inside the room was a collection of dolls, each one with an eerie and unsettling look on its face. Some were missing limbs, while others had eyes that seemed to follow the friends around the room. But that wasn't the worst of it. As they looked closer, they saw that each doll had a name written on it, and the names were those of the friends themselves. Panic set in as they realized that they were not alone in the house. Someone, or something, had been watching them and had set up this twisted display as a warning. The friends quickly left the farmhouse, but they never forgot what they had seen, and they always wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in the house just a little bit longer. Emily had always loved playing the piano. As a child, she spent hours practicing and perfecting her technique. When she grew up and moved into her own apartment, she bought a beautiful baby grand piano and placed it in the center of her living room. But something was off about the piano. Sometimes, when Emily played, she heard strange noises coming from inside it. And sometimes, when she was alone in the apartment, she heard a sound of someone else playing the piano, even though she knew she was the only one there. Emily tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but they only got worse. One night, she woke up to the sound of the piano playing on its own. When she got up to investigate, she saw that the lid of the piano was open, and the keys were moving on their own. Emily was scared, but she didn't know what to do. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that it was just a malfunction in the piano's mechanics. But then, the piano started playing a tune that Emily had never heard before. It was beautiful, but haunting at the same time. As the music continued, Emily realized that it was a song that her grandmother used to play for her when she was a child. Her grandmother had died many years ago, but Emily had always felt a special connection to her. Emily listened to the song in awe, but as it came to an end, she felt a cold chill run down her spine. She heard a voice whisper in her ear, "Thank you for playing with me, Emily. I've missed you so much." Emily turned around, but there was no one there. She knew that the voice belonged to her grandmother, and that the piano was haunted by her spirit. From that day on, Emily could feel her grandmother's presence every time she played the piano. It was a comforting feeling, but also a haunting one. She knew that she was never truly alone when she played, and that her grandmother was always with her, watching over her from beyond the grave. Katie loved going for walks in the forest near her house. She enjoyed the peace and quiet of the trees, and the way the sun dappled through the leaves. But one day, something strange happened. As she was walking along the path, she noticed a shadow moving behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off, thinking that it was just a trick of the light. But as she continued on her walk, the shadow kept following her. Every time she turned around, it disappeared. And every time she looked away, it reappeared, closer than before. Katie started to feel uneasy. She quickened her pace, hoping to get out of the forest before anything else happened. But as she reached the edge of the trees, the shadow materialized into a figure. It was a man, tall and dark, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her. Katie tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to break free from the man's gaze. And then, suddenly, he was gone. The shadow dissipated, leaving Katie alone in the forest. She stumbled out onto the street, gasping for air. Katie never went back into the forest again. but she could always feel the shadow, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for her to return. And she knew that she would never be able to escape its grasp. Sarah had always been a curious child. She loved exploring and discovering new things, even if it sometimes got her into trouble. One summer day, Sarah wandered into the woods behind her house, following a trail that she had never seen before. She walked deeper and deeper into the forest, marveling at the lush greenery and the singing of the birds. As the sun began to set, Sarah realized that she had gone farther than she meant to. She turned around to head back home, but quickly realized that she was lost. The trees all looked the same, and she couldn't remember which way she had come from. Sarah tried retracing her steps, but the more she walked, the more lost she became. Panic started to set in as the darkness descended, and she was suddenly very aware of the eerie silence that had fallen over the forest. Just as Sarah was about to give up hope, she saw a light in the distance. It flickered like a candle flame, beckoning her forward. Relieved, Sarah hurried towards the light, hoping that she would find help. But as she drew closer, she saw that the light was coming from an old abandoned cabin. Sarah hesitated, wondering if she should continue on or turn back. But she was so desperate to find her way home that she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, and Sarah could barely make out the outlines of the furniture in the flickering light. She called out, hoping that someone would answer, but there was no response. As Sarah moved further into the cabin, she noticed something odd about the walls. They were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the candlelight. Sarah couldn't understand the symbols, but she felt a sense of unease growing within her. It was as if the symbols were alive, pulsing with a dark energy that she couldn't comprehend. And then she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low, guttural chanting, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. Sarah tried to run, but it was too late. The chanting grew louder and louder, filling her mind with a terrible dread. And then she saw them, the figures emerging from the shadows. They were hooded, their faces hidden in the shadows. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, surrounding Sarah on all sides. Sarah wanted to scream, but she couldn't find a voice. She was frozen in fear as the figures closed in on her. And then, suddenly, the chanting stopped. The figures disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone in the silent cabin. Sarah stumbled outside, gasping for breath. She looked back at the cabin, wondering if it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw the symbols on her own skin, glowing faintly in the moonlight. And she knew that the nightmare had only just begun. It was the middle of the night when Lily woke up to a strange sound. She lay in bed, listening carefully, trying to identify the noise. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, coming from somewhere in the house. At first, Lily assumed it was just her imagination. But as the thumping continued, growing louder and more insistent, she realized that there was definitely something going on. She got out of bed and crept down the hallway, following the sound. It led her to the living room, where the thumping was now so loud that she could feel it vibrating through the floor. Lily hesitated, wondering if she should wake her husband. But she didn't want to worry him if it turned out to be nothing. So she took a deep breath and stepped into the living room. And that's when she saw it. The thumping was coming from the floor, which was bulging and pulsing like some kind of giant heart. As Lily watched, a crack appeared in the center of the bulge, widening slowly. Lily stumbled backwards, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched in horror as the crack grew wider and wider, revealing a pulsing mass of flesh and bone and sinew. And then something emerged from the crack, something that Lily couldn't identify at first. It was dark and shapeless, a writhing mass of limbs and tendrils. But as it drew closer, she saw that it had a face that was twisted into a grotesque, inhuman grin. Lily wanted to scream, but she couldn't find a voice. She stumbled backwards, tripping over a piece of furniture and falling to the ground. And then the creature was on top of her, its tendrils wrapping around her limbs and pulling her towards its gaping maw. Lily closed her eyes and waited for the end. But then she heard a sound that made her heart leap with hope. It was the sound of her husband's voice, shouting her name. Lily opened her eyes and saw her husband standing in the doorway, a look of horror on his face. And then the creature was gone, disappearing back into the crack in the floor as quickly as it had appeared. Lily and her husband never spoke of that night again, but they both knew that something unspeakable had happened in their house, something that they could never fully understand or explain. Sophie had always been fascinated by the old mansion on the hill. As a child, she would often walk by the property and stare up at the towering structure, imagining the secrets that lay within its walls. As an adult, Sophie became a historian, and the mansion remained a constant source of curiosity for her. She spent years researching the history of the property, hoping to uncover the truth about the mysterious family who had once lived there. One day, Sophie received a phone call from a woman who identified herself as the mansion's current owner. The woman had read some of Sophie's research and was impressed by her knowledge of the property. She invited Sophie to come and visit the mansion and take a tour. Sophie was thrilled by the invitation and eagerly accepted. She arrived at the mansion on a bright, sunny day, a notebook and camera in hand. The current owner, a woman named Elizabeth, greeted Sophie at the door and led her through the mansion's many rooms. Sophie was amazed by the grandeur of the property, with its soaring ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and intricate woodwork. But as they walked, Sophie began to notice something strange. The rooms seemed to change as they moved through them, shifting in size and shape. Sometimes the walls would be close together, making the room feel cramped and claustrophobic. Other times, the walls would be impossibly far apart, making the room seem endless. At first, Sophie assumed that she was imagining things. But the more they walked, the more she realized that something was very wrong with the mansion. Finally, Elizabeth led Sophie to a small room tucked away in a corner of the mansion. Inside, there was a dusty old trunk. "I think you'll find this interesting," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the trunk. Sophie approached the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside, she found a stack of old journals. "These belonged to the family who lived here," Elizabeth explained. "They detail the strange things that happened in this mansion." Sophie began to read the journals, her heart racing. She learned that the mansion was built on top of a portal to another dimension, and that the family who lived there had made a deal with the entities who lived beyond the portal. In exchange for wealth and power, the family agreed to allow the entities to use their mansion as a gateway into our world. As Sophie read on, the room began to shift and change around her. The walls grew closer, the air grew thick and heavy. And then she heard a voice, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome," the voice said. "We've been waiting for you." Sophie tried to run, but the mansion had already claimed her. She was trapped in its shifting, twisting corridors, doomed to spend eternity as one of the mansion's many victims. Lucas was a photographer, and he specialized in taking pictures of abandoned buildings. He loved the way the old structures had a certain beauty to them, even as they crumbled and decayed. One day, Lucas got a tip about an old mental hospital that had been abandoned for years. The hospital was known for its brutal treatment of patients, and many people believed that it was haunted by the ghosts of those who had suffered and died there. Despite the rumors, Lucas was eager to explore the hospital and capture its eerie beauty on film. He arrived at the hospital early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. As he entered the hospital, he felt a chill run down his spine. The building was massive, but it was filled with an oppressive silence that made him feel uneasy. But Lucas pressed on, his camera at the ready. He wandered through the hospital, taking pictures of the peeling wallpaper and the rusted metal doors. As he made his way through one of the hospital wings, he heard a noise behind him. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Lucas turned around, but there was no one there. He shrugged it off and continued taking pictures. But then he heard the footsteps again, closer this time. He spun around again, but still there was no one there. Lucas was starting to feel scared now. He had heard stories about the ghosts of the hospital, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And then, suddenly, he saw her. A ghostly figure, dressed in a hospital gown, was standing at the end of the hallway. Lucas could see right through her, and he knew that she was one of the hospital's many victims. He raised his camera to take a picture, but before he could snap the shutter, the ghostly figure disappeared. Lucas was shaking now, but he knew that he had to keep moving. He couldn't let his fear get the better of him. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed that the walls were covered in strange writing. It looked like some kind of code, and Lucas couldn't make sense of it. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the midst of the writing, he saw his own name. Lucas stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He realized then that he had made a terrible mistake coming to the hospital. The ghosts of the patients were still there, and they were not happy to be disturbed. He turned and ran, not looking back until he was safely outside. And even then, he could feel the weight of the hospital's dark past on his shoulders. From that day on, Lucas never photographed abandoned buildings again. He knew that there were some places that were better left untouched, and some secrets that were better left buried. Haley had always been afraid of the dark. She hated the way the shadows seemed to dance and move, creating sinister shapes and figures that made her heart race with fear. One night, Haley woke up to find that her bedroom was completely dark. The power must have gone out, she thought to herself. But as she tried to get out of bed, she realized that something was wrong. Her body felt heavy and sluggish, as if she were stuck in place. And then she heard a voice, a soft whisper in the darkness. "Hello, Haley," the voice said. "Do you remember me?" Haley recognized the voice immediately. It was her old imaginary friend, Emily. She hadn't thought about Emily in years, but now her memory came flooding back. Emily had been Haley's constant companion when she was a child. They had gone on adventures together, exploring imaginary worlds and having all sorts of fun. But then, as Haley got older, she had stopped playing with Emily. She had forgotten all about her, until now. "Emily," Haley said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to play with you," Emily said. "Just like old times." Haley tried to move again, but she couldn't. It was like she was trapped in some kind of invisible force field. "I don't want to play," Haley said, her voice growing more urgent. "Let me go, Emily." But Emily didn't listen. She began to sing a haunting melody, a lullaby that Haley remembered from her childhood. As she sang, the darkness grew thicker and more oppressive. like a physical weight pressing down on Haley's chest. Haley closed her eyes and tried to block out the sound, but it was no use. The lullaby seemed to be coming from inside her own head now, filling her with a sense of dread and unease. And then, suddenly, there was a flash of light. The power had come back on, and Haley could see again. She looked around her room, but there was no sign of Emily. Haley never forgot at night, and she never slept with the lights off again. Even as an adult, she always kept a lamp on in her bedroom, just in case Emily ever decided to visit her again. Sophie had always loved exploring abandoned places. She found the history and mystery behind them fascinating, and she enjoyed the thrill of exploring a place that had been untouched for years. One day, Sophie heard about an old mansion on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for decades. She decided to check it out, so she packed her camera and a few supplies and made her way to the mansion. As soon as she stepped inside, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. The mansion was dark and musty, and she could hear strange noises coming from the shadows. Sophie pressed on, exploring room after room, searching for any clues to the mansion's history. She took photographs of the old furniture, the peeling wallpaper, and the dusty chandeliers. As she reached the top floor, Sophie heard a strange sound coming from one of the rooms. It sounded like a child crying. She cautiously approached the room and opened the door, only to find that it was completely empty. But the crying sound was still there, louder than ever. Suddenly, Sophie felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned around to see a ghostly figure hovering in the air behind her. The figure was that of a little girl, with long, tangled hair and a pale face. Sophie tried to run, but the little girl's ghostly hand grabbed her by the wrist, and she felt a surge of energy flow through her body. Sophie was transported back in time, to when the mansion was still occupied. She saw the little girl playing in the garden, laughing and running with her dolls. But then, she saw something terrible happen. The little girl's father, a cruel and abusive man, had beaten her to death. Sophie was horrified by what she saw, but then she realized that she had a chance to change her past. She confronted the little girl's father and convinced him to change his ways, to become a kind and loving father who would never harm his daughter. As Sophie returned to the present day, she felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. The mansion was no longer haunted by the little girl's ghost, and Sophie had helped to right a terrible wrong from the past. Samantha was an avid collector of antique dolls, and she had just acquired a beautiful dollhouse from a local estate sale. The dollhouse was intricately detailed, with miniature furniture and even tiny curtains on the windows. Samantha couldn't wait to display it in her home. But as soon as she brought the dollhouse home, strange things started to happen. The curtains would move on their own, and the miniature furniture would be rearranged when Samantha wasn't looking. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the strange occurrences became more and more frequent. One night, Samantha was awakened by a strange noise coming from the dollhouse. She got out of bed and approached the dollhouse, her heart pounding in her chest. As she looked through the tiny window, she saw a figure moving inside. It was a tiny porcelain doll, dressed in a Victorian-era gown. Samantha gasped in shock, as the doll turned to look at her with tiny, unblinking eyes. The next morning, Samantha decided to investigate the dollhouse further. As she opened the tiny front door, she felt a cold breeze wash over her. Inside, the furniture was arranged in a sinister pattern, as if someone had deliberately arranged it that way. But as she looked closer, she saw that the dolls were not dolls at all. They were tiny, lifelike replicas of people she knew. Her friends, her family, even her own miniature likeness was there. As she gasped in horror, she felt a tiny hand wrap around her ankle. She looked down and saw the Victorian doll looking up at her with a wicked grin. "You belong to me now," the doll whispered, as Samantha felt herself shrinking down to doll size. And with that, she was trapped in the dollhouse forever, a tiny plaything for the porcelain dolls to torment and torture. Sarah had always been curious about the attic in her family's old house. Her parents had told her that it was a storage space, filled with old clothes, books, and toys that they no longer used. But Sarah had a feeling that there was something more to the attic than just junk. One day, when her parents were out of the house, Sarah decided to investigate the attic. She climbed the creaky stairs, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. When she reached the top, she found herself in a dimly lit room, filled with cobwebs and dust. At first, Sarah didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There were boxes and bags stacked up hesitantly against the walls, and a few old pieces of furniture covered in sheets. But then, something caught her eye. It was a mirror. A large, ornate mirror that seemed out of place in the cluttered attic. Sarah walked over to it, studying her reflection in the dusty glass. But then, she saw something move behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, and saw that her reflection was no longer her own. It was someone else entirely. A girl with dark hair and a pale face, staring back at her with cold, dead eyes. Sarah tried to look away, but she couldn't. The girl in the mirror seemed to be drawing her in, tempting her with a strange and terrifying power. Sarah felt her mind slipping away, her body becoming numb and cold. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Sarah blinked, and her own reflection was staring back at her once more. She stumbled away from the mirror, her heart racing with fear and confusion. Sarah never went back to the attic again. She tried to forget about the mirror and the girl who had appeared in it, but she could never quite shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to look into the glass once more. Lena had always been fascinated by the woods near her house. She loved to explore the winding paths and discover hidden treasures. But one day, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a shadow. A shapeless, dark figure that seemed to move in the trees, always just out of sight. Lena tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As the days went on, the shadow appeared more frequently. Lena became obsessed with it, determined to discover what it was and where it came from. She spent every spare moment in the woods, following the shadow's movements and trying to catch a glimpse of its form. One night, Lena finally saw the shadow up close. It was standing in a clearing, just a few feet away from her. Lena froze, unsure of what to do. The shadow seemed to grow larger and more menacing, and Lena realized with horror that it was reaching out to her. But then, something unexpected happened. The shadow began to change shape, transforming into a beautiful, radiant light. Lena felt a sense of warmth and comfort wash over her, and she knew that she was safe. The light spoke to Lena, telling her that it had been watching over her all along, protecting her from harm. It was a guardian spirit, one that had been assigned to watch over Lena and keep her safe in the woods. From that day on, Lena no longer feared the shadow in the woods. She knew that it was there to protect her, and she felt grateful for its presence in her life. She continued to explore the woods, but now she did so with a newfound sense of wonder and appreciation for the mysteries of the natural world. It was just another ordinary day for the employees of the high-rise office building. They had all taken the elevator up to their respective floors and were busy at work when the elevator suddenly stopped moving. At first, they thought it was just a minor glitch, but then the lights flickered and strange noises could be heard coming from the elevator shaft. Panic set in as they realized that they were trapped inside the elevator, with no way out. As they frantically tried to call for help, the lights went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. That's when the real horror began. Whispers could be heard, as if someone was standing right next to them, breathing heavily in their ear. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the air became thick with a sense of foreboding. And then, they heard a voice that spoke in an ancient language, one that none of them could understand. The employees were petrified, huddled together in fear as the voice continued to speak. They could feel a cold presence in the elevator with them, one that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. Just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, the elevator suddenly jerked back to life and began to move again. It finally came to a stop on the next floor, and the door slowly opened. The employees stumbled out of the elevator, shaken to their core. They looked around, but there was no one there. No sign of the mysterious voice or the cold presence that had haunted them just moments before. To this day, no one knows what caused the elevator to malfunction and what kind of entity they had encountered inside. But one thing was certain, they would never look at elevators the same way again. The old farmhouse had been abandoned for years, but it had always been a source of fascination for the locals. Stories had circulated for decades about the strange things that had happened there, and the rumors only grew stronger as the years went on. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the farmhouse and see for themselves what all the fuss was about. They drove out to the property, parked their car, and walked up to the house. The place was in shambles, with broken windows and a roof that was caving in. But despite its obvious state of disrepair, the friends couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they approached the front door. Once inside, they realized that the rumors were true. Strange things were happening in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and they heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As they explored the house, they found themselves drawn to a locked door at the end of the hallway. It was the only door in the entire house that seemed to be in good condition, with a shiny brass knob and fresh paint. Curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to break open the door. When they did, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. Inside the room was a collection of dolls, each one with an eerie and unsettling look on its face. Some were missing limbs, while others had eyes that seemed to follow the friends around the room. But that wasn't the worst of it. As they looked closer, they saw that each doll had a name written on it, and the names were those of the friends themselves. Panic set in as they realized that they were not alone in the house. Someone, or something, had been watching them and had set up this twisted display as a warning. The friends quickly left the farmhouse, but they never forgot what they had seen, and they always wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in the house just a little bit longer. Katie loved going for walks in the forest near her house. She enjoyed the peace and quiet of the trees, and the way the sun dappled through the leaves. But one day, something strange happened. As she was walking along the path, she noticed a shadow moving behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off, thinking that it was just a trick of the light. But as she continued on her walk, the shadow kept following her. Every time she turned around, it disappeared. And every time she looked away, it reappeared, closer than before. Katie started to feel uneasy. She quickened her pace, hoping to get out of the forest before anything else happened. But as she reached the edge of the trees, the shadow materialized into a figure. It was a man, tall and dark, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her. Katie tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to break free from the man's gaze. And then, suddenly, he was gone. The shadow dissipated, leaving Katie alone in the forest. She stumbled out onto the street, gasping for air. Katie never went back into the forest again, but she could always feel the shadow, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for her to return. And she knew that she would never be able to escape its grasp. As a kid, Lucy was always afraid of the dark. She would never sleep without a nightlight and would always make sure the curtains were closed tight before going to bed. But as she grew up, Lucy realized that her fear was irrational and gradually overcame it. One summer night, Lucy's parents went out of town, leaving her alone in their large, isolated house. Lucy felt a bit uneasy at first but decided to take advantage of the opportunity to enjoy a quiet night in. As the night wore on, Lucy began to feel tired and decided to head to bed. As she climbed under the covers, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. It had been years since she felt like this, and it was unsettling. She turned on the nightlight and tried to shake the feeling off. She lay there for what felt like hours, unable to sleep. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from outside her window. She turned to look, but it was too dark to see anything. The noise grew louder, and Lucy began to feel frightened. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind or an animal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Finally, Lucy decided that she had to face her fear and investigate. She got up and made her way to the window, peering outside. At first, she couldn't see anything, but then her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw a figure standing outside her window. Lucy gasped and stumbled backward, her heart racing. The figure began to move, and she realized it was trying to climb inside. Lucy backed away, trying to think of what to do. She felt trapped and vulnerable, and her mind raced with all sorts of terrifying thoughts. Suddenly, the figure pushed its way through the window, and Lucy screamed. But then the figure stepped fully into the light, and she saw that it was just her childhood friend, Tom. Tom had always been a bit of a prankster, and he thought it would be funny to scare Lucy. But seeing her terrified reaction, he realized that he had gone too far. Lucy was angry at first, but then she couldn't help but laugh at the situation. From that night on, Lucy was no longer afraid of the dark. In a strange way, the experience had helped her overcome her fear once and for all. It was a beautiful painting, a portrait of a young woman with long golden hair and piercing green eyes. But there was something eerie about it, something that made people feel uneasy whenever they looked at it. Some even claimed that the woman in the painting would follow them with her gaze. The painting had been passed down through generations of a wealthy family, but nobody knew its true origin. Some said that it was cursed, that the woman in the painting was a witch who had been captured and trapped in the canvas. Others believed that the woman had died tragically and that her spirit had somehow become trapped in the painting. One day, a new family moved into the old mansion and hung a painting in their parlor. They didn't believe in curses or ghosts, and they admired the painting's beauty. But soon they began to notice strange things happening in the house. Objects would move on their own, strange noises would echo through the halls, and sometimes they would catch a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of their eye. And every night, the woman in the painting seemed to come alive, her eyes following them as they moved through the room. The family tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but they soon realized that they were not alone in the house. The woman in the painting was a vengeful spirit, and she was determined to take revenge on those who had trapped her in the canvas. One night, the family woke up to find the painting had disappeared from the parlor. They searched the house, but it was nowhere to be found. But then, as they turned a corner, they saw it hanging on the wall, in a different position, and now the woman's eyes were staring directly at them. They tried to take the painting down, but it was as if it was attached to the wall, and no amount of force could remove it. That's when they realized the truth. The woman in the painting was not cursed, nor was she a vengeful spirit. She was a real woman, who had been trapped in the canvas as punishment for a crime she didn't commit. And now, she was seeking revenge on those who had kept her imprisoned for so long. The rumors surrounding the old mansion had always been eerie, but nobody had ever dared to explore it. That is, until a group of friends decided to break in one night. They climbed over the fence and found a way inside, each one feeling a mix of excitement and fear. The mansion was dark and cold, the air heavy with the smell of decay. They cautiously made their way through the halls, flashlight beams dancing along the walls. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and the furniture looked as if it had been touched in years. As they explored the upper floors, they came across a door that was locked. One of the friends, feeling brave, picked the lock and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, and they had to use their flashlights to see. What they saw sent shivers down their spines. The room was filled with old dolls, their glass eyes reflecting the beams of their flashlights. Some were missing limbs, while others had cracked porcelain faces. The dolls were arranged in a circle, as if in the midst of a tea party. Suddenly, one of the dolls moved. The friends froze in terror as they watched the doll's head turn, its glass eyes locking onto theirs. And then, to their horror, all of the dolls began to move, their limbs creaking as they turned their heads to face the intruders. The friends ran, their screams echoing through the halls as they stumbled down the stairs and out of the mansion. They never went back, and nobody ever knew what happened to the dolls or what would put them there. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the dolls creaking and rustling, as if they're waiting for someone to come back and join their tea party. Karen had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion at the end of her street. The mansion was old and dilapidated, with overgrown vines and broken windows. Rumor had it that the mansion was haunted, and that the ghosts of the former occupants still roamed the halls. One day, Karen decided to explore the mansion. She was convinced that the stories of ghosts were just made up to scare people, and that there was nothing to be afraid of. As soon as Karen entered the mansion, she knew that she had made a mistake. The air was thick with dust and decay, and she could hear strange noises coming from upstairs. But Karen was determined to explore, and she continued to make her way through the mansion. As she climbed the stairs, Karen heard a faint whisper. She couldn't make out what was being said, but the voice sounded like it was coming from right beside her. Karen turned around, but there was no one there. Karen's heart was pounding as she continued up the stairs. She had always been skeptical of the paranormal, but now she wasn't so sure. She felt like someone was watching her every move. Finally, Karen reached the top of the stairs. She saw a door at the end of the hallway, and she knew that she had to see what was inside. As she approached the door, she heard a loud creaking noise. The door was opening by itself. Karen hesitated for a moment, but then she pushed the door open. Inside, she saw a room filled with old furniture and dusty books. But there was something else in the room too. Something that made Karen's blood run cold. Sitting in the center of the room was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with long black hair covering her face. The woman was holding a book in her lap, and she was staring straight at Karen. Karen tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The woman stood up, and Karen could see the anger in her eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The woman vanished into thin air, leaving Karen alone in the room. Karen never went back to the mansion again. She had seen something that she couldn't explain, and she knew that the rumors of ghosts were true. From that day on, Karen was a believer in the paranormal, and she knew that there were things in this world that were beyond our understanding. Sarah had always been skeptical of the paranormal. She thought that all the ghost stories and hauntings were just made up to scare people. But one night, something happened that changed her mind. Sarah was staying at an old hotel in the countryside. She had chosen the hotel because of its rustic charm and history. But as soon as she arrived, she felt uneasy. The atmosphere was oppressive, and there was a sense of heaviness in the air. That night, Sarah went to bed early, exhausted from her journey. But she was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud banging on her door. She jumped out of bed, heart racing, and opened the door. But there was no one there. Sarah tried to rationalize the noise, telling herself that it was just a wind or an animal. But then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps that seemed to be getting closer. Sarah's fear turned to terror when she saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with long dark hair covering her face. The woman was walking towards her, slowly but steadily. Sarah tried to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. The woman was getting closer and closer, and Sarah could see the hatred in her eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The woman vanished into thin air, leaving Sarah alone in the empty hallway. Sarah couldn't explain what had happened. She was convinced that she had seen a ghost, and that the hotel was haunted. She never returned to that hotel again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly woman was still watching her, even from beyond the grave. Julia had always been fascinated by abandoned places. So when she heard about an old hospital on the outskirts of town that had been shut down for years, she couldn't resist exploring it. She arrived at the hospital late at night, her heart pounding with excitement. The place was creepy, with broken windows and peeling paint. But to Julia, it was beautiful in its own way. As she explored the empty halls and rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. But she dismissed the feeling as nerves and continued on. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper that seemed to be coming from one of the rooms. Julia felt a chill run down her spine as she cautiously made her way towards the sound. The room was dark, with only a small amount of moonlight filtering through the broken window. Julia saw a figure in the corner of the room and she froze. It was a woman, sitting on the floor with her head in her hands. Julia asked if the woman was okay, but she didn't respond. As Julia got closer, she noticed that the woman's skin was cold and pale. And then she saw the blood stains on the woman's clothes. Julia realized too late that she had stumbled upon a crime scene. She ran out of the hospital, frantically calling the police. When they arrived, they found the body of a woman who had been murdered and left to die in the abandoned hospital. Julia was never the same after that night. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman she had seen, and the terror she must have experienced in her last moments. She stopped exploring abandoned places, realizing that sometimes, the past should stay buried. When Lily moved into her new apartment, she was excited to start a new chapter in her life. She had just landed her dream job and was looking forward to living on her own for the first time. But as the days passed, Lily began to feel uneasy in her new home. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like she was being watched. Strange things started happening too, like objects moving on their own and doors opening and closing by themselves. At first, Lily tried to convince herself that she was just being paranoid. But then, one night, she woke up to find a woman standing at the foot of her bed. The woman was wearing old-fashioned clothes and had a sad expression on her face. Lily screamed, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at her. Finally, Lily mustered up the courage to turn on the light. When she did, the woman was gone. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her apartment. She decided to do some research and discovered that the building was over 100 years old and had a dark history. It turned out that the woman Lily had seen in her room was a former resident of the building who had died in a tragic accident. Her spirit was said to still haunt the halls of the apartment complex. Lily tried to ignore the strange occurrences and carry on with her life, but the ghostly presence in her apartment only grew stronger. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, Lily heard a whisper in her ear. It was a voice she recognized as the woman's. "Get out," the voice said. "Get out before it's too late." Lily knew then that she had to leave. She packed her bags and left the apartment, never looking back. But even as she moved into her new home, she couldn't help but wonder what other spirits lurked in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. Sophie had always been fascinated by the supernatural. She loved reading ghost stories and watching horror movies. One day, while browsing the internet, she came across a website that claimed to offer real-life ghost tours. Without hesitating, Sophie signed up for a tour of a supposedly haunted house in the nearby countryside. The tour was set to take place that very night, and Sophie couldn't wait to experience something truly spooky. As she arrived at the house, Sophie was immediately struck by its eerie appearance. The walls were covered in ivy, and the windows were boarded up. She followed the tour guide through the creaky front door and into the dark hallway. The guide explained that the house was once owned by a wealthy family who had all died under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it that their ghosts still haunted the halls of the house, seeking revenge on those who dared to enter. Sophie listened intently as the guide led the group through the house, pointing out various spots where supernatural activity had been reported. But as they reached the top of the stairs, Sophie suddenly felt a cold breeze brush past her. She shivered, but tried to brush it off as a draft. The group continued on, and Sophie began to feel increasingly uneasy. As they entered a dimly lit room, she noticed a strange figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with long black hair covering her face. Sophie gasped, but the guide assured her that it was just a mannequin used to add to the creepy atmosphere of the house. Sophie tried to calm down, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequin was watching her. As the tour came to an end, Sophie was relieved to be leaving the haunted house. But as she walked back to her car, she realized that she had left her phone inside. Without hesitating, she ran back inside to retrieve it. As she entered the house once more, Sophie felt a cold hand grab her shoulder. She turned around, only to find the mannequin standing right behind her. But then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The mannequin's eyes were moving, and it was smiling at her. Sophie realized that it wasn't a mannequin at all, but a real woman, possessed by the spirits of the haunted house. She screamed, but it was too late. The ghost had claimed another victim. As a child, Caroline always had a fascination with the abandoned mansion at the edge of her small town. It had been vacant for years, and local legend had it that it was cursed. The townspeople avoided it at all costs, but Caroline couldn't resist the temptation to explore it for herself. One summer day, Caroline gathered up her courage and ventured inside. The interior was dark and musty, and she had to use her phone's flashlight to guide her way. As she walked through the deserted halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from upstairs. Her heart racing, she slowly climbed the staircase, step by step. As she reached the top, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a twisted grin on his face. Caroline froze, unsure of what to do. The man began to move towards her, and she could see the glint of a knife in his hand. In a panic, she turned and ran, but she could hear his footsteps echoing behind her. Finally, she burst through the front door and ran as fast as she could back to her house. She locked the doors and called the police, but when they arrived and searched the mansion, they found nothing. Years later, Caroline returned to her hometown for a visit. As she walked through the streets, she caught sight of the abandoned mansion once again. It looked just as foreboding as it had all those years ago. Curiosity getting the best of her, Caroline approached the mansion and peered inside. To her surprise, she saw the shadowy figure from her childhood, standing in the exact same spot as before. But this time, she could see his face clearly. It was her own reflection, staring back at her from a dusty old mirror. Caroline had never encountered the man in the abandoned mansion that day. It had been her own fear and imagination playing tricks on her all along. It was a dark and stormy night, and Sarah was driving home from a late shift at work. She lived in a small town surrounded by dense forests and winding roads, and she had always found the area a little eerie. But tonight, the storm made everything seem even more sinister. As she drove, Sarah saw a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible through the rain. She slowed down to get a better look, and she realized it was a woman in a tattered dress, holding a lantern. Feeling a pang of sympathy, Sarah pulled over and rolled down her window. "Do you need help?" she asked. The woman turned to her, and Sarah gasped. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pain, and her eyes were black as coal. Before Sarah could react, the woman lunged at her, and Sarah felt a sharp pain in her neck. The last thing she saw was the woman's sinister grin as the world went dark. Days later, a search party found Sarah's car abandoned by the side of the road. Her body was never found, but there were rumors of a ghostly woman who haunted the forest, preying on unsuspecting travelers. But the truth was even more horrifying. The woman who had attacked Sarah was no ghost, she was a victim of a terrible experiment gone wrong. Her body had been injected with a virus that turned her into a monster, and she had been left to wander the forest, searching for her next victim. And now, Sarah was just like her, infected and doomed to roam the woods, seeking revenge on those who had done this to her. Maggie had always been curious about the abandoned mansion on the edge of town. It had been empty for as long as she could remember, but she had heard rumors that it was haunted by the ghost of its former owner, a wealthy businessman who had died under mysterious circumstances. One day, Maggie decided to investigate. She climbed over the rusty fence and made her way towards the mansion. The front door was locked, so she went around to the back and found a window that was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and climbed inside. The mansion was dark and musty. Maggie made her way through the dusty rooms, feeling a strange sense of unease. She heard strange noises coming from upstairs and knew that she wasn't alone. As she climbed the stairs, she saw a figure in the shadows. It was the ghost of the mansion's former owner. Maggie was terrified, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. The ghost beckoned her to follow him, and she reluctantly did. They walked through the halls, and Maggie felt like she was being led to something important. Finally, they reached a hidden room. Inside, there was a safe. The ghost motioned for Maggie to open it. She hesitated but then reluctantly complied. Inside the safe, she found a letter. The letter detailed a businessman's plan to fake his own death and start a new life in another country. It was a shocking revelation, and Maggie realized that the ghost was actually the businessman himself, still haunting the mansion after all these years. Maggie felt a sense of relief, knowing that the mansion wasn't haunted by a vengeful ghost after all. She left the mansion and went to the authorities with a letter, revealing the businessman's plan. But as she walked away, she felt a chill run down her spine. She heard a whisper in her ear that she couldn't quite make out. She turned around, but there was no one there. Maggie knew that the businessman was still watching her, even in death. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just become a part of his ghostly world. Carla was on a road trip with her friends when their car broke down in the middle of nowhere. They were stranded on the deserted stretch of road with no cell service and no other cars in sight. As they tried to figure out what to do, they noticed a small town in the distance. It looked like it was abandoned, but they decided to check it out anyway. They walked towards the town, hoping to find help. As they got closer, they noticed that the town was covered in a thick fog. They could barely see anything in front of them, but they continued on, desperate for help. Finally, they reached the center of the town. They saw a small church and decided to go inside. The doors creaked as they pushed them open, and they stepped into the dimly lit sanctuary. As they looked around, they saw that there were no pews or altar. The walls were covered in strange symbols and the air was thick with the scent of incense. Suddenly, they heard a noise from the back of the room. They turned to see a group of people standing there. They were all dressed in black robes and their faces were obscured by hoods. Carla and her friends were terrified. The group began to chant in a language they didn't understand. They couldn't move, paralyzed with fear. The chanting grew louder and more intense, and Carla and her friends felt like they were going to be swallowed by the darkness. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chanting stopped. The group of hooded figures slowly turned and walked out of the church, disappearing into the fog. Carla and her friends were shaken by the experience, but they were relieved to be alive. They quickly left the town, getting back on the road and driving as far away as they could. As they drove, they talked about what had just happened. They were certain that they had stumbled upon some sort of dark cult. But then, they heard a noise from the trunk of the car. They pulled over and opened the trunk, only to find a note that read, "You should have stayed in the town. Now, you'll never escape." Carla and her friends realized that they had never left the town at all. The entire experience had been an illusion created by the cult to lure them in. They were trapped in the town forever, doomed to become the next members of the cult. Emily was excited to start her new job as a night security guard at the old museum. She had always loved history and thought it would be cool to spend her nights surrounded by artifacts from the past. The first few nights were uneventful, and Emily spent most of her time patrolling the empty halls. But on the fourth night, things took a dark turn. As she made her way through the museum, she noticed that some of the exhibits had been moved. She knew she was the only one there, so she became uneasy. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but as she continued her rounds, she heard strange noises echoing through the halls. She heard footsteps coming from the ancient Egyptian exhibit, and as she approached, she saw that one of the mummies had been removed from its case. She looked around, but there was no one there. She tried to call for help, but her phone had no signal. She was completely alone, and the museum seemed to be alive with activity. She heard a sound of chanting coming from the exhibit, and she knew she had to investigate. As she got closer to the exhibit, the chanting grew louder. She looked around and saw that the other exhibits had been moved as well. It was as if the museum was coming to life. Finally, she reached the Egyptian exhibit and saw that the mummy was standing upright. It was surrounded by a group of hooded figures, all chanting in unison. Emily was frozen with fear. Suddenly, the mummy began to move. It stepped down from its pedestal and started walking towards her. Emily turned to run, but she tripped and fell. She knew it was the end. But then, everything went silent. She looked up and saw that she was alone. The mummy was back in its case, and the exhibits were all in their original positions. Emily couldn't believe what had just happened. She thought she had lost her mind, but as she made her way back to her office, she saw a note on her desk. It read, "Welcome to your first night at the museum. We hope you enjoy the show." Emily realized that it had all been a test. She had passed the initiation ritual and was now a member of the secret society that ran the museum. She was relieved but also shaken by the experience. She knew that her job was going to be much more than just guarding artifacts from the past. Emma was always the adventurous type. She loved exploring abandoned buildings and forgotten places. So, when she heard about the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, she knew she had to check it out. As she entered the crumbling building, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the halls were dark and foreboding. But Emma pressed on, eager to explore every inch of the creepy asylum. As she walked deeper into the building, Emma began to hear strange noises. She couldn't tell if it was just her imagination, or if something was actually following her. Her heart raced as she tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, she heard a loud crash from behind her. Emma spun around, but saw nothing. She continued walking, but now she was sure that someone or something was following her. She started to run, her heart pounding in her chest. Emma burst into a room and slammed the door shut behind her. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. But then, she heard a low growling noise coming from the other side of the door. She realized too late that she had trapped herself in the room with whatever had been following her. The growling turned into snarling as the door shook under the weight of a creature outside. Emma's heart sank as she realized she was trapped. But then, the door suddenly stopped shaking, and the growling ceased. Emma cautiously opened the door and peered outside. To her surprise, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. Emma breathed a sigh of relief and turned to leave. But as she walked away, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared behind her, and a cold hand grabbed her shoulder. Emma screamed and turned around, only to see a figure standing before her. It was a demon, with sharp claws and blackened wings. Emma tried to run, but the demon grabbed her and pulled her closer. "I've been waiting for you," the demon hissed. "I've been watching you explore this place, and I knew you were the one I needed to help me." Emma was terrified, but the demon explained that it needed her help to banish an evil spirit that had been haunting the asylum. Together, they fought the evil spirit and managed to send it back to the underworld. As Emma walked away from the asylum, she realized that sometimes the things that scare us the most can also lead us to unexpected places. She had never believed in demons, but now she had a newfound appreciation for the supernatural. Rachel was a thrill-seeker who loved to explore abandoned places. So when she heard about the abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, she knew she had to check it out. As she made her way through the rusty old factory, she felt a sense of excitement and adventure. The factory was huge, with endless corridors and rooms to explore. She could hear the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As she made her way deeper into the factory, she began to feel like someone was watching her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off and continued exploring. Finally, she came to a room that was filled with old machinery. She climbed up onto one of the machines to get a better view of the room, but as she did, the machine suddenly turned on. The machine started to move, and Rachel realized that she was trapped. She tried to climb down, but the machine wouldn't stop. She was being pulled deeper into the factory, and she had no idea how to escape. She screamed for help, but no one came. Finally, the machine came to a stop, and Rachel found herself in a dark, underground room. She looked around and saw that she wasn't alone. There were other people down there, all trapped just like she was. Rachel realized that the factory was being used to harvest people for their organs. She knew she had to find a way to escape before it was too late. She searched the room for a way out, but everything was locked up tight. As she sat in the dark, cold room, Rachel realized that she was going to die there. She had always thought that exploring abandoned places was a harmless thrill, but now she knew the truth. She was paying the ultimate price for her love of adventure. As the hours turned into days, Rachel began to lose hope. But just when she thought it was all over, the door to the room suddenly swung open. She couldn't believe it. She was free. As she stumbled out of the factory, she realized that the price of her adventure was almost too high. She had narrowly escaped with her life, but she would never forget the horrors she had seen. Samantha loved exploring old, abandoned buildings. So, when she heard about the abandoned hospital on the edge of town, she knew she had to check it out. As she made her way through the deserted hospital, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the halls were dark and foreboding. But Samantha pressed on, determined to explore every inch of the creepy hospital. As she walked deeper into the building, she began to hear strange noises. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, but every time she turned around, there was no one there. She tried to ignore it and kept walking, but the noises continued to grow louder. Finally, Samantha came to a room that had been boarded up. She used all her strength to pry the boards loose, and as she entered the room, she felt a chill run down her spine. The room was completely empty, except for an old hospital bed in the center. But what made Samantha uneasy was the feeling that she was being watched. She spun around, but saw nothing. She tried to leave the room, but the door was now jammed shut. As she struggled to open the door, she heard a faint whispering. She couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like a voice from beyond the grave. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Samantha fell backward onto the hospital bed. She looked up and saw a ghostly figure hovering over her. It was the ghost of a patient who had died in that very bed. The ghostly patient explained that she was trapped in the hospital, unable to move on to the afterlife. Samantha was terrified, but she knew she had to help the ghost move on. Together, they searched the hospital for a way to release the ghost from her earthly prison. Finally, they found an old diary that contained the key to the ghost's release. As Samantha read the diary out loud, the ghostly patient began to fade away. Samantha was relieved that she had been able to help the ghost, but as she turned to leave, she realized that she had been in the room for hours. The sun had set, and it was now completely dark outside. She looked around the room and realized that everything was still exactly as it had been when she had first entered. She had lost track of time, and it felt like she had been trapped in that room for an eternity. As she made her way out of the hospital, Samantha realized that sometimes, helping others can come at a high price. She never explored abandoned buildings again, knowing that sometimes, the things we encounter can be more than we bargained for. Katie had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion on the hill. It was rumored to be haunted, but Katie didn't believe in ghosts. So, one day, she decided to sneak inside and explore the mansion for herself. As she made her way through the dusty halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. But she ignored the feeling and continued exploring. As she entered one of the bedrooms, she saw a strange object on the dresser. It was a dusty old music box. Katie couldn't resist the urge to wind it up and hear the old melody it played. But as the music box began to play, the room started to spin around her. She felt dizzy and disoriented as the walls and floor seemed to shift and change. Suddenly, the music box stopped playing, and everything went quiet. Katie looked around and realized she was no longer in the old mansion. Instead, she was standing in the middle of a strange, unfamiliar world. The sky was a sickly green color, and the trees were twisted and gnarled. In the distance, she could see a dark, foreboding castle looming over the landscape. Katie knew she had to find a way out of this strange world. As she wandered through the twisted forest, she came across a group of villagers who looked at her with suspicion and fear. They warned her of a dark lord who ruled this land with an iron fist. Katie knew she had to find a way to defeat the Dark Lord and escape this world. With the help of the villagers, Katie learned of a magical sword that could defeat the Dark Lord. She set out on a perilous journey to find this sword and return home. It was a dangerous mission, but Katie was determined to succeed. After a long and treacherous journey, Katie found this sword and battled the Dark Lord. With a final blow, the Dark Lord fell, and the world around her started to fade away. Katie opened her eyes and found herself back in the abandoned mansion. She looked at the music box on the dresser and realized it was the key to her escape. As she wound up the music box again, she was transported back to the real world. Katie couldn't believe what had just happened. It was a surreal and terrifying experience. But as she walked away from the abandoned mansion, she realized that sometimes the most unexpected things can lead us to incredible adventures. Sarah had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would constantly ask her parents to leave a nightlight on in her room. As she grew older, she tried to conquer her fear by going on ghost tours and watching horror movies. But despite her efforts, she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her when the lights went out. One night, Sarah was home alone. She had just finished watching a horror movie and was feeling particularly jumpy. As she turned off the TV and headed to her bedroom, she heard a strange noise coming from downstairs. She froze in fear, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, but the noise stopped. She convinced herself it was just her imagination and continued up to her room. As she got ready for bed, Sarah heard the noise again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from her closet. She cautiously approached the closet and slowly opened the door. To her relief, there was nothing there. Just as she turned to leave, a cold hand grabbed her from behind. Sarah screamed and turned around to find a figure standing in front of her. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes. Sarah tried to run, but the figure grabbed her again, pulling her closer. As she looked into its eyes, she realized that it wasn't human. It was a demon. Just as Sarah thought it was all over, the demon spoke. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I had to scare you. It was the only way to get your attention. You're in danger, and I need your help to stop it." Sarah was shocked. She had never believed in demons, but now she was face to face with one. The demon went on to explain that a group of rogue demons were planning to invade the human world and wreak havoc. They had already started to infiltrate human society, but if Sarah was willing to help, they could stop them before it was too late. Sarah agreed to help, and together with the demon, she set out to stop the rogue demons. It was a dangerous mission, but they succeeded in stopping the invasion. In the end, Sarah had conquered her fear of the dark and had even made an unlikely ally in a demon. As Sarah looked back on the events of that night, she realized that sometimes the scariest things can lead to the most unexpected outcomes. There was a small village where every year on the night of the full moon, a strange event would occur. The villagers would gather in the town square, light bonfires, and perform a ritual to ward off the evil spirits that were said to roam the area. One year, a young girl named Lily was out playing with her friends when she stumbled upon a hidden cave in the forest. She had heard stories of the cave, but had never seen it for herself. Curiosity got the best of her and she ventured inside. It was dark and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of rotting leaves. As she made her way deeper into the cave, she suddenly heard a sound. It was a soft whisper, coming from the shadows. She couldn't make out what it was saying, but she knew that she was not alone in the cave. Fear set in as she tried to find a way out, but the cave seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the whispers grew louder and more insistent. And then, she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was a spirit, or so she thought. It floated towards her, its hands outstretched. Lily tried to run, but she was trapped. And then, something even more terrifying happened. The spirit spoke, its voice like 1,000 voices all at once. "You are the one," it said. "The one we have been waiting for. The one who will bring us back to life." Lily was frozen with fear as the spirit possessed her, taking over her body and mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the spirit disappeared, leaving Lily alone in the cave. Days later, the villagers noticed that something was different about Lily. She seemed distant and cold, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. On the night of the full moon, Lily did not join the other villagers in the town square. Instead, she made her way to the cave in the forest. And as the villagers watched in horror, Lily began to chant, summoning the spirits to return. And they did. The spirits emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. And Lily was one of them, forever trapped in the spirit world. In a remote village, there was a forest where no one dared to go. It was said that the forest was cursed, and that those who entered it never came back. But one day, a man named John decided to ignore the warnings and venture into the forest. As he made his way through the dense undergrowth, he began to feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in on him, and the air grew thick with an oppressive silence. But he pressed on, determined to uncover the truth about the cursed forest. As the sun began to set, John suddenly heard a sound. It was a soft whisper, coming from the shadows. He couldn't make out what it was saying, but he knew that he was not alone in the forest. Panic set in as he tried to find a way out, but the trees seemed to shift and move, blocking his path. And then, he saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was a creature, or so he thought. It floated towards him, its hands outstretched. John tried to run, but he was trapped. And then, something even more terrifying happened. The creature spoke, its voice like 1,000 voices all at once. "I have been waiting for you," it said. "You are the one who will set me free." John was frozen with fear as the creature possessed him, taking over his body and mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared, leaving John alone in the cursed forest. Days later, the villagers found John, wandering the streets in a state of shock. He was unable to explain what had happened, but all he kept repeating was one phrase: "I am not myself. I am not myself." And as the villagers watched in horror, John transformed before their very eyes. His body contorted and twisted, until he was no longer human. The creature had been freed, and now it roamed the forest, waiting for its next victim to set it free once again. In a small town, there was a legend about a cursed house. It was said that anyone who entered the house would never come out again. The townspeople had long avoided the house, but one day, a group of teenagers decided to investigate. They snuck into the house, determined to uncover the truth about the curse. As they made their way through the dusty, cobweb-filled rooms, they began to feel a sense of unease. But they pressed on, determined to prove that the curse was just a myth. As they reached the top floor of the house, they suddenly heard a sound. It was a soft whisper, coming from the shadows. They couldn't make out what it was saying, but they knew that they were not alone in the house. Panic set in as they tried to find a way out, but the doors and windows were all locked. And then, they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was a ghost, or so they thought. It floated towards them, its hands outstretched. The teenagers tried to run, but they were trapped. And then, something even more terrifying happened. The ghost spoke, its voice like 1,000 voices all at once. "I am not a ghost," it said. "I am a demon, and I have been trapped in this house for centuries. But now, I have found a new host." The teenagers were frozen with fear as the demon possessed one of them, taking over their body and mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the demon disappeared, leaving the teenagers alone in the cursed house. Days later, the townspeople found the teenagers, wandering the streets in a state of shock. They were unable to explain what had happened, but they all agreed on one thing. The cursed house was not just a myth. It was a portal to something much, much darker. In a small, isolated village nestled in the mountains, there lived a woman named Anna. Anna was known throughout the village for her beauty, but she was also feared. For Anna was a witch, and the villagers believed that she had the power to control the elements. One day, a group of young boys decided to play a prank on Anna. They snuck into her cottage and stole one of her spellbooks, thinking it would be a harmless joke. But they were wrong. That night, a fierce storm descended upon the village. Lightning struck the trees, and the wind howled like a banshee. The villagers huddled in their homes, praying for the storm to pass. But the storm didn't pass. It raged on for days, tearing apart homes and causing widespread destruction. The villagers were terrified, and they knew that they had to do something to stop it. They turned to Anna, begging her to help them. Anna agreed, but only on one condition. She wanted the boy who had stolen her spellbook to come forward and confess. The boy was terrified, but he knew that he had to do the right thing. He stepped forward, admitting to his crime. Anna took him away, promising to lift the curse that had befallen the village. Days passed, and the villagers began to feel hope once again. The storm had finally subsided, and they believed that Anna had saved them. But then, something strange happened. The boy who had confessed to stealing Anna's spellbook returned to the village. but he was not the same as before. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his voice was deep and menacing. "I made a deal with Anna," he said, his voice echoing through the village. "She gave me the power to control the elements. And now, I will use that power to destroy you all." The villagers tried to flee, but it was too late. The boy conjured up a powerful storm, unleashing the full fury of the elements upon the village. Homes were destroyed, and people were swept away by the wind and rain. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm dissipated. The boy was nowhere to be seen, and the villagers were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They realized too late that Anna had not saved them. She had only been using them to gain more power. And now, they were at the mercy of a boy who had become something much, much worse. There was a small town that was home to an old, abandoned asylum. The asylum had been closed for years, but its dark history lived on. It was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of the patients who had died within its walls, and locals avoided it at all costs. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the asylum, thinking it would be a fun adventure. They snuck in through a broken window and began to explore the dark, labyrinthine halls. As they made their way deeper into the asylum, they began to hear strange noises. Footsteps echoed in the darkness, and whispers filled the air. But they pressed on, determined to uncover the secrets of the abandoned asylum. As they entered a particularly creepy wing of the building, they suddenly heard a scream. It was one of their friends, and they ran to find her. They found her in a small, dark room, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw something," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw something moving in the shadows." The friends brushed it off as a trick of the light, but as they made their way back to the entrance, they realized that something was wrong. They were lost, and they couldn't find their way out. Panic set in as they wandered the dark halls, feeling as though they were being watched. And then, they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, shrouded in darkness. It was one of the patients, or so they thought. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and it moved with an unnatural grace. The friends tried to run, but they were trapped. And then, something even more terrifying happened. The figure spoke, its voice like 1,000 voices all at once. "I am not one of them," it said. "I am something else entirely." The friends were frozen with fear as the figure approached them. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it disappeared, leaving the friends alone in the darkness. Days later, the friends were found by a search party, wandering the forest in a state of shock. They were unable to explain what had happened, but they all agreed on one thing. The abandoned asylum was not haunted by the spirits of the patients who had died within its walls. It was something much, much worse. There was a small village nestled in the heart of the forest. The villagers were known for their hospitality and kindness, but they also had a dark secret. Every year, on the same day, they sacrificed one of their own to a powerful entity that lived in the woods. The villagers believed that the sacrifice ensured their safety and prosperity for the rest of the year. They had done it for generations, and it had become a twisted tradition that they dared not break. One year, a young girl named Sarah stumbled upon the village by accident. She was lost and alone, and the villagers took her in, offering her food and shelter. But as the day of the sacrifice drew near, Sarah realized that something was off. The villagers became more and more agitated, and she knew that she had to escape. As she fled into the forest, she stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was the only place she could find to hide, so she went inside, hoping to wait out the night. But as the night wore on, Sarah began to hear strange noises outside. She tried to ignore them, but they grew louder and more menacing. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the villagers appeared, holding torches and knives. "We know you're in there, Sarah," they said. "Come with us, or we'll drag you out." Sarah realized that she had no choice but to go with them. She was surrounded, and they were too strong for her to fight. So she followed them back to the village, hoping that she could somehow escape before it was too late. But as she arrived in the village square, she realized that it was already too late. The villagers had already begun the sacrifice, and they had chosen her as their victim. As they prepared to sacrifice her, Sarah closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle. And then, the miracle happened. A bolt of lightning struck the village square, and the ground shook beneath their feet. When Sarah opened her eyes, she saw something that she would never forget. The entity that the villagers had been sacrificing to was real, and it was not pleased. It emerged from the forest, a towering figure with eyes that glowed with a fiery light. The villagers were no match for it, and they were consumed by its wrath. But as Sarah watched in horror, she realized that she had been spared. The entity turned to her and spoke, its voice like thunder. "You are not one of them," it said. "You are free to go." And with that, Sarah fled the village, never looking back. She knew that she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and she was grateful to be alive. But she also knew that she would never forget the terror of that night, or the shocking revelation that awaited her in the heart of the forest. There was a small town that was known for its unusual weather patterns. Every year, on the same day, a violent thunderstorm would roll through the town, leaving destruction in its wake. The locals had learned to prepare for the storm, but they always dreaded its arrival. One year, the storm was particularly intense. Lightning struck the tallest building in the town, a dilapidated old mansion that had been abandoned for years. The mansion had always been rumored to be haunted, and the locals avoided it at all costs. But after the storm, something strange happened. The mansion seemed to come alive. The windows glowed with an eerie light, and strange noises could be heard coming from inside. A group of teenagers decided to investigate, thinking it would be a fun dare. As they crept through the dark hallways, they felt a sense of dread wash over them. The mansion was indeed haunted, and they were not alone. Suddenly, a ghostly figure appeared before them. It was an old woman, dressed in a white gown, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. She told them to leave the mansion and never return, warning them that it was not safe. The teenagers heeded her warning and fled the mansion, never daring to return. But the ghostly figure stayed with them, haunting their dreams and filling their thoughts with fear. Years later, one of the teenagers returned to the town, hoping to put the memory of the haunted mansion behind him. But as he walked through the town, he realized that something was off. The town was deserted, with no sign of life anywhere. As he made his way to the mansion, he found it as he remembered it, dark and foreboding. But when he went inside, he found something even more terrifying. The ghostly figure was there, waiting for him. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice filled with malice. "You should have listened to my warning." As the teenager tried to flee, he realized that he was trapped. The mansion had become a prison, and he was doomed to spend eternity there, haunted by the ghostly figure in the storm that never ceased. There was a group of friends who loved to go on adventures and explore abandoned places. One day, they heard about an old hospital that had been abandoned for decades, and they decided to investigate it. The hospital was eerie and desolate, with broken windows, peeling wallpaper, and an overall feeling of unease. As they explored the building, they came across a strange room that seemed to be sealed shut. Despite their better judgment, they decided to break the lock and see what was inside. As soon as they opened the door, A cold wind rushed out, chilling them to the bone. Inside a room, they found an old, dusty mirror that seemed to be glowing with an eerie light. They were drawn to it, unable to resist its pull. As they looked into the mirror, they saw their reflections begin to change. Their eyes turned black, their skin grew pale, and their features twisted into grotesque shapes. They tried to look away, but they were trapped, unable to break the mirror's spell. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, and they were plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, they found themselves in a completely different place. They were in a strange, otherworldly realm, with no way of escape. They wandered for days, lost and terrified, until they stumbled upon a group of other lost souls who had been trapped in the realm for years. They told them that the only way to escape was to find the mirror and put it back together. The group set out on a quest to find the mirror, facing countless obstacles and dangers along the way. Finally, after weeks of searching, they found it. As they put the mirror back together, they felt a sense of relief wash over them. They had done it. They were going to be free. But just as they were about to leave the realm, they heard a voice behind them. It was a voice they recognized, but it was distorted and filled with malice. "You can't leave," the voice said. "You belong to me now." As they turned around, they saw their reflections in the mirror, twisted and evil, staring back at them. They had been tricked all along. The mirror had never been a way out, it had been a way in. They screamed as they were dragged back into the realm, their fates sealed forever. There was a young woman named Emily who had just moved into an old, run-down house in the countryside. It was a beautiful but eerie place, with creaky floorboards, squeaky doors, and strange noises coming from the attic. Despite the reservations, Emily felt drawn to the house and couldn't resist its charm. One night, as she was settling into bed, Emily heard a faint whispering sound. She tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and more persistent, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with her. Eventually, she got up and followed the sound to the attic. There, she found an old trunk covered in cobwebs. As she opened it, she discovered a collection of letters written by the previous owner of the house, a woman named Martha. The letters revealed that Martha had been murdered by her husband, who had buried her body somewhere on the property. Emily was horrified by the discovery, and as she tried to leave the attic, the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped, alone in the dark with the ghost of Martha. The ghost whispered to her, telling her that she would never leave the house alive. For days, Emily was trapped in the attic, surviving on scraps of food and water. She tried to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. She resigned herself to her fate, waiting for the ghost to claim her soul. But just as Emily was about to give up hope, she heard a strange noise coming from the trunk. It was a faint scratching sound, and as she listened closer, she realized that it was coming from inside the trunk. She pried it open, and to her shock and horror, she found Martha's husband inside, alive and well. He had been hiding there all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. In a moment of desperation, Emily fought back, using all her strength to subdue the murderous husband. She managed to escape the attic and the house, fleeing into the night. The next day, the police arrived to investigate the strange occurrences at the house. As they searched the property, they discovered the remains of Martha's body buried in the garden. But there was no sign of Emily or the murderous husband. Years later, a young couple moved into the same house, unaware of its dark past. As they settled into bed on their first night, they heard a faint whispering sound coming from the attic. And so the cycle continued, as the ghost of Martha claimed yet another victim. It was a dark and stormy night, and Mary was driving home from a friend's party. As she drove down the deserted road, she suddenly saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. She hit the figure, and her car spun out of control and crashed into a ditch. Shaken and scared, Mary stumbled out of the car and approached the figure. It was a man, but his face was obscured by the darkness. He was wearing a long coat, and his hair was matted and messy. He didn't say a word, but instead, he just stared at Mary with dark, empty eyes. Mary tried to talk to the man, but he didn't respond. She started to feel uneasy, and her heart began to race. She took a step back, but the man followed her. She took another step back, but he kept coming closer. Suddenly, Mary realized that the man wasn't a man at all. He was a ghost, a vengeful spirit who had been hit and killed by a drunk driver years ago on the same road. Mary tried to run, but the ghost was too fast. It chased her down the road, its ghostly hands reaching out to grab her. Just when Mary thought all hope was lost, a bright light appeared in the distance. It was a police car, and the ghost disappeared as soon as the officers arrived. They took Mary back to the station, where she spent the rest of the night shaking and crying. The next day, Mary went back to the scene of the accident to retrieve her car. As she was standing by the ditch, she saw something glinting in the grass. She bent down to pick it up, and her heart froze. It was a ghostly handprint, burned into the ground where the ghost had stood the night before. As Mary looked at the handprint, she realized that she was lucky to be alive. But then, she heard a whisper in her ear. "I'm still here," the ghost said. Mary turned around, but no one was there. She started to run, but she didn't get far. The ghost had followed her, and this time, it wasn't going to let her go.